The historic Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, comes to a close amid colorful pomp and pageantry. Considered one of the most important councils in Catholic Church history, Vatican II saw 2,400 bishops and other prelates revise many aspects of church activity. It was the first full church council in nearly a century, and the 21st in history. In 168 sessions from October 1962, the council produced 16 documents designed to modernize the role of the church in world affairs. The council was called at the behest of Pope John XXIII, and its work was carried on by Paul VI. The results will have an influence on both religious and secular affairs for centuries to come. The pontiff closed the sessions with messages to world rulers, to intellectuals, to artists and workers, to the invalid and to the poor. These were appeals that all men seek peace through brotherhood, the end of war through understanding. Along with Catholic prelates, there are 100 observers from other faiths and 85 diplomats at the closing ceremonies. A pontifical mass is offered that success might crown the aims of the Vatican Council. There are an estimated 100,000 people in St. Peter's Square. The final blessing is for the assembled throng and for the world. Ite in pace, go in peace. A blessing echoed round the world by men of goodwill.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt for the Remnant Forum. Today we're going to be talking about Vatican II and this idea that in order for us to, or for traditionalists, to have the traditional Mass, it becomes necessary for us to swear an oath of fidelity or loyalty, de facto anyway, to the Second Vatican Council. And this has been going on for a lot of years. Back in March of 1977, the late, great Jean Madiran, the French traditionalist luminary, said the following with respect to the Vatican trying to cajole and force Archbishop Lefebvre to take this odd oath of fidelity to Vatican II. At that time, Madiran says, quote, "The Vatican is requiring of Archbishop Lefebvre a statement of adherence to the Council under the pretext that no Catholic may withdraw himself from such adherence. It is pure trickery, a mere show, a pretense. Because what is required of Archbishop Lefebvre is in reality is that he give recognition to Vatican II as a council with as much authority and even more important than the Council of Nicaea. Through such deceitfulness, it is sought to impose as equally obligatory and more essential than dogmas the untoward pastoral innovations of Vatican II. Archbishop Lefebvre refuses this deceit, and we refuse it alongside of him," end quote. Again, 1977, Jean Madiran. Now let's fast forward to May 19th, 2014, when Cardinal Bras de Aviz of the Congregation for Religious has essentially placed the Franciscan Sisters now of the Immaculate under apostolic visitation. Read, investigation. And the sisters' crime? Well, according to Father Fidenzio Volpi, the sisters are guilty of, quote, wait for it, a distorted mentality. In other words, crypto-Lefebvrean and definitely traditionalist drift. In other words, the sisters are too tradition-minded. The sisters are too Catholic. The sisters are not going along with the spirit of Vatican II program. Now, over at the Remnant's website, Remnant columnist Chris Jackson concludes from this that, quote, "Thus, being Catholic is now apparently dangerous, subversive, and crypto-Lefebvrean to the Vatican's Congregation for Religious," end quote. And who is this Bras de Aviz? According to John Allen, the veteran Roman journalist, Bras de Aviz is seen as very close to heretical groups such as Focolare and has long been seen by supporters of the Latin Mass movement as, quote, an enemy. Meanwhile, Chris Ferrara, it's no surprise to any of us that the Franciscan Friars are running for the tall grass, trying to get away from this oath of obedience that they have taken to the Vatican and looking for friendly bishops around the world who do not see Catholicism as such a threat as apparently the Vatican does at the moment.
Yeah, well, that's what's going on. We're in the grips of a veritable ideology. Monsignor Pozzo, in his address to the priests of the priestly fraternity, back in July of 2010, referred to a paraconciliar ideology. We need to distinguish the council in terms of its texts many of which repeated classic teaching, some of which contain these ambiguities that have vexed the church ever since. We need to distinguish those texts from this phrase, acceptance of the council. Because
yeah, what does that mean, Chris? What does acceptance of the council really mean?
What they're talking about is not acceptance of a set of documents or concrete propositions, but acceptance of simply an ideology. The ideology consists of the proposition that somehow the church has surpassed her prior history and has become something new at the council. Monsignor Pozzo described this as a rupture with the past and a radical change in history. Cardinal Ratzinger called it a 0 hour, in which suddenly the church begins anew at the Second Vatican Council, as if nothing had come before. This is what they mean by acceptance of the council, because in terms of text, putting aside some of these ambiguities, nothing in the council requires us to believe a single thing that we didn't believe before the council. So what is it they're asking us to accept when they demand that we accept the council? Obviously, they want us to accept the state of the church as it is today, which has been created in the name of the council. And that condition of the church is one of liturgical collapse, the emptying of the seminaries, the emptying of the convents, closing of schools, closing of parishes, and silent apostasy. These ideologues, these fanatics of Vatican II, whose average age is over 70 at this point, are simply going to refuse to acknowledge that the aggiornamento of the church, as they understand it, is a catastrophic failure. And what is going on right now is a last-ditch effort by this old guard to force it down our throats one last time. This paraconciliar ideology.
That's exactly right, Chris. And the thing is, I think the Vatican has jumped the shark. There's a certain degree of desperation that they're now beginning to manifest. And just to jump off your last point, we are talking about a bunch of aged guys. I would even go so far, maybe it's disrespectful, but to suggest we have hippies that are looking back at Woodstock and trying to make it everything that they thought it was going to be, and in fact, it's a disaster. But let me just, last time we did this program, we talked about Brett Decker at USA Today making some of these observations, Brendan Michael Doherty at theweek.com. Here's one from, actually from EWTN, essentially. This is an article that came out a couple of days ago by Pat Archbold from the National Catholic Register, Chris. And I think it's important to read just a couple paragraphs to show, again, what you just said. These aged folks in the Vatican are out of touch with what a lot of younger guys are saying. So Mr. Archbold says, when it comes to traditionalists in the church, the hits just keep coming. We have now the regretful news that the Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate will join their brethren in the deepest fog and fire of purgatory. The Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate have suffered under the draconian rule of their imposed commissioner under the direction of His Eminence Braz Davies, prefect of the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, for the crime, Chris, for the crime of crypto-Lefebvrianism and justified by supposed dissent. And then Mr. Archbold concludes, I suspect in the end, as the FI and other traditionalists have been sold to the Egyptians and their colored cloak soaked in blood as proof of their demise, one day the church will be very thankful that these traditionalists endured and preserved treasure for use during the famine. Chris, this comes basically from EWTN beginning to admit it.
Mike, people are waking up. They're understanding that the crisis is reaching a new level under this Pope with his innumerable confused and disturbing utterances and gestures, and they're frightened. A lot of people are now frightened. They don't know what to do. The easy answer is to become a sedevacantist, which of course we reject because we have a Pope. The other easy answer is to do what the Neo-Catholics do. Stick your head in the sand, pretend we don't have a Pope. So on one hand, we have the sedevacantists who act as if there is no Pope, and the Neo-Catholics who effectively act as if there is no Pope. We're confronting the reality of the situation, which is that we have a Pope who, I have to say this in all candor, and I believe it's my right to say it as a member of the faithful, is guilty of the very thing he accuses traditional Christians of being. He's guilty of being an ideologue. That is why the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate are in the bullseye of his target. That is why he personally authorized the destruction of that order. And the Apostolic Commissioner, Father Volpi, Fox in Italian, has made it quite clear that he's acting on explicit orders of the Pope effectively to destroy this order. That is the order that receives the Pope's jackbooted suppression.
That's a good point, Chris, because even Mr. Archibald's his column here, as good as it is, he does seem to stop with Bras d'Avis, when in fact, obviously, whether it's Volpe or Bras d'Avis, this is Francis's work. This is what Francis wants to happen. There's no point in questioning or denying that, correct?
Well, we're not making this up. Look at paragraph 94 of Evangelii Gaudium, in which he says that traditionalists, and that's exactly who he's referring to, are guilty of a self-absorbed Promethean Neo-Pelagianism, and of those who ultimately trust only in their own powers and feel superior to others because they observe certain rules or remain intransigently faithful to, get this, a particular Catholic style from the past. That is a nakedly ideological statement which reduces everything in the church that existed before Vatican II to a mere style that can be forgotten and, in the case of the Franciscan Friars, brutally suppressed. If that isn't ideology, I don't know what is. You want more proof? Here's a statement by Carballo, the secretary of the Congregation for Consecrated Life, the Franciscan Jose Rodriguez Carballo, explaining the motives for why the sisters now are coming under the Inquisition. Because, he says, we are seeing true deviations. Deviations? What? From Catholic doctrine? From the liturgical laws of the Church? From what? Well, he tells us from what. Not a few institutes, he says, give not only a pre-conciliar, but even an anti-conciliar formation. This is inadmissible. It is to place oneself outside of history. So this is the ideology we're talking about. Historicism in the church, a kind of Hegelian outrolling of church history in which the past is surpassed, and now we have this new thing that everyone must bow to. And the idea that they don't have a conciliar formation, but a pre-conciliar formation, you could write a whole book on that. What in heaven's name is a pre-conciliar formation? What could he mean by that?
I think that's a Catholic formation, Chris.
What?
And you wonder why there's so much self-loathing. You know, you have so many Catholics today, if they're still even bothering to go to Mass, they loathe the Latin Mass. They have no time for encyclicals or for the perennial magisterial teachings of the Church. They're self-loathing Catholics. And you read some of this from Pope Francis, and you kind of understand where it's coming from. The Pope himself seems to have a real problem with 1,965 years of Catholic history.
Well, it's obvious, and the people that he's appointed to put his reforms in motion all indicate that they are subject to these same ideological pretensions. I mean, let's unpack a little bit this phrase, pre-conciliar formation. What this prelate is saying, or what Father Carballo is saying, on behalf of the Secretary of the Congregation for Consecrated Life, is that after Vatican II, there's a new type of formation. What else could he possibly mean?
Yeah,
and what is this new formation? They're not telling us. Like Protestantism, the new formation is simply anti, in some inchoate way, whatever came before. That's all we know about it. It's anti the pre-conciliar church.
Yeah, that's right. And how do we reconcile this? We've several times now, we've done whole programs on that lecture or speech by Pope Benedict XVI back in 2013, where he's talking about the fact that the council was taken over, was commandeered by the media. It was a virtual council and all that. So when they're talking about this lockstep acceptance of Vatican II, which form of Vatican II? The virtual council, the real one? Which one? Because we even have the Pope saying it all went off the rails.
Well, when they say you must accept Vatican II, what are they really saying, Mike? They're saying you must accept the imposition of our will as fallible human beings. You must accept this reform or that reform, and you must stop publishing books that are too traditional, and you must undertake a post-conciliar formation. Again, this is never really clearly defined, except that we know it isn't traditional. And this is what this paraconciliar ideology is all about. Monsignor Pozzo, in this amazing address that was too soon forgotten in July 2010, says that this paraconciliar ideology was, and I'm quoting, imposed on the council from the beginning and overshadowed it. And then he goes on to say, the revolution of 1968 must indeed be acknowledged. taking as its point of departure rupture with the past and a radical change in history. What else could they be talking about when they suppress an order of holy traditional nuns, youthful vocations, by the way, at a time when the vocations in the convents are disappearing? What else could they be talking about? Why else could they be suppressing these nuns, except that they're too darned Catholic? This is a terrifying reality that we're confronting, that we are now confronted with. And the Pope has a council of 8 consisting entirely of progressives of this mentality.
Do you think, Chris, when you think about the age, I don't know what the average age of the Franciscan Friars or of the sisters is, but one gets the impression that the ones that I've seen, for example, at the Chartres pilgrimage in France, these are younger people. There are a lot of young monks and priests and sisters that I've seen. And so one wonders again if the problem we have here are a lot of these young Franciscans are interested in the traditional Mass. I mean, they're bi-ritual as an order. They're not as traditional as the Fraternity of St. Peter, for example, but they are bi-ritual, and there are more and more of them that were interested, more and more of the young priests who are interested in the Latin Mass and everything that implies. And that, it seems to me, is some sort of a threat to, as I said, the sort of aging octogenarian hippies inside the Vatican.
Well, speaking of aging octogenarians, now we're hearing identified as the Pope's theologian, none other than Cardinal Walter Casper.
So, Cardinal Casper, could you tell me if you do really believe that there is a future for ecumenism?
Oh yes, I believe it, because it's a mandate of Jesus Christ himself. It's a mandate of the Second Vatican Council, and we have harvested so many good fruits. Why we should go ahead? There are always difficulties on the way. It's normal in human history, and we go on with this. And I think so many people that expect it also are waiting for good fruits, and so we are not allowed and permitted to stop.
Age 80, one of the most pestiferous heretics of the post-conciliar era. And this man has denied the historicity of the apostolic succession, and now he's openly calling for the admission of public adulterers in second so-called marriages to Holy Communion, saying that there's an abyss between church teaching and the lies of Christians in this regard. Of course there's an abyss. They've apostatized. They're not following the teaching of the church anymore. So Casper's approach is to accommodate them in their disobedience and their departure from church teaching. Well, if you're going to do it for the divorced and remarried, then we should do it for everybody who's in an objective condition of mortal sin because of disregard of the church's fundamental teaching on marriage and procreation, which is hundreds of millions of people. And this is the Pope's theologian now. He went to New York, where he was interviewed on public radio as the Pope's theologian. And he said some absolutely astonishing things, one of which was, well, Catholics, the way they do contraception, that's a matter of conscience. The Church is not at all opposed to contraception, he said. And then you look at the head of the Council of 8, the Council of 8 Cardinals, who, when confronted with Archbishop Mueller's courageous defense of the traditional teaching, something, by the way, we never expected from him, over at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the prefect or the head of this College of Advisors, Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga, says, oh, well, this is just my brother who thinks in black and white terms, in terms of good or bad. What? So this is a problem that the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith thinks in black and white terms, in terms of good or bad? Then he goes on to say, Mike, but the world isn't like that, my brother. You should be a bit flexible when you hear other voices. This is the head of the Council of Cardinals that the Pope has formed to spearhead his, and I shudder to think what they will involve, reforms of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, this is like
Here we go again.
The Magnificent Eight, right? They're going to come and save the day, and they're part of the problem more than anything else. And you can see in Cardinal Casper, again, that sort of the workings of a very aged man, that he thinks that if he starts tweaking some of these things, like the Catholic Church is teaching on faith and morals, that he's going to bring the millions back. And that's almost sad, isn't it? What do you think? They're going to come back? These are people who have set themselves against the teachings of the Catholic Church. There's nothing Cardinal Casper can say up there in the Vatican that's going to bring these folks back, with the possible exception of a return to some discussion from the prelates, from the princes of the Church, about heaven and hell and sin and things that people need to hear about right now.
Well, this whole program of making the Church more appealing to the modern world world has ended up by making the church less appealing to Catholics who have left in droves. We're in the midst of silent apostasy. And there's no way you're going to bring people back to the church by watering down the message and diminishing by the day the importance of membership in the Catholic Church. People are simply going to walk away. So now the approach is, well, they've all walked away because they didn't like the church's former rigorous teaching. In other words, orthodoxy. So let's compromise in the field of practice while paying lip service to the teaching. This is the new program, and this is how deluded these people are. Maradiaga says that, this is not a joke, this is not a parody. I strongly believe that the church has reached the dawn of a new era as it did 50 years ago when John the 23rd opened the window to let some fresh air in.
They're still at that,
This is the essence of an ideologue. He blinds himself to reality, embraces his ideology, and he pursues it to the bitter end. We're going to open the windows again and let in some more fresh air? We've had 50 years of fresh air. It's nothing but air pollution.
Yeah, and not only do you have Catholics dissenting from dogma now in the church, but you have them dissenting in droves from the church's moral teaching. And the question I would love to put to some of these guys is, back in the 1930s and 40s, how many people did you have? How many practicing Catholics were dissenting from the church's moral teaching on life, on contraception, on abortion? I mean, statistically speaking, Chris, zero. If they were practicing the faith, they were accepting the church's teaching. Now, since the Second Vatican Council, you have people doing whatever they want. You have millions of Catholics literally chucking the church's moral teaching. In what sense can that be considered by a prince of the church to be springtime? I don't get it.
It's the dawn of a new era. It's the dawn of the era of apostasy. But they don't see it. They refuse to see it. They refused to see what Paul VI admitted in 1972. He could already see that his experiment had gone off the rails and that the result was already disastrous. And Monsignor Pozzo quotes the Pope's famous statement about the smoke of Satan, but I'm going to read this whole thing to you because he gives the entire context of the quote. By some fissure there has entered into the temple of God the smoke of Satan. There is doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest. Doubt has entered our consciences, meaning all of us, referring to the church in 1972. And it has entered through the windows which were meant to have been opened to the light. The state of uncertainty reigns even in the church. It was hoped that after the council there would be a day of sunlight in the history of the church. Instead there came a day of clouds, of darkness, of groping, of uncertainty. How did this happen, the Pope asks. We will confide our thoughts to you. There has been interference from an adverse power. His name is the devil. Now that's from Paul VI, Insegnamenti, the Vatican edition, volume 10, 1972, page 707, quoted by Monsignor Pozzo, who was and still is the secretary of the Ecclesia Dei Commission. Now the neo-Catholics have desperately tried to minimize the Pope's devastating admission, saying that he was talking about a couple of wayward theologians, a few modernists in the seminaries and so forth. Utter nonsense. The Pope was talking about the state of the church only 7 years after Vatican II had ended.
Yeah, you know, I've actually heard some of my neo-Catholic friends say that what he was talking about, the smoke of Satan, was actually the fact that Ronner and Congar and some of these guys, Shilabix, didn't leave the church but stayed on, and how terrible it is. And when you hear them say this, Chris, I'm always reminded of the Protestants who, you know, when you cite Scripture, for example, you might say, our Lord said, upon this rock I will build my church, speaking to Peter. And the Protestants say, well, he's not talking about Peter, he's talking about a rock in the ground. He's pointing to a rock, or whatever it might be. The neo-Catholics are engaging in the same sort of silliness. But the reality is, Pope Paul VI, before he died, was already seeing the smoke of Satan come about. The smoke of Satan, which, by the way, now has taken the whole world and church by storm, it seems.
Well, here's what's going on now. We have the Sedevacantists who have basically lost their minds over this. They say we have no pope. In fact, we have no bishops. You have no hierarchy because, according to them, the ordination rites and the episcopal consecration rites were corrupted after the council and are no longer valid. So they've gone off the deep end in one direction, saying that the church is basically defected. Then we have the Neo-Catholics, on the other hand, trying to pretend that Paul VI didn't say what he said, and that we aren't in the midst of an unprecedented crisis where the smoke of Satan has entered the church. They're both denying reality. Reality is we have diabolical disorientation in the church. We do have a pope, we do have a hierarchy, but they're affected by this disorientation. Just like almost the entire church was carried away by the Arian heresy. This has happened before. It's happening again on an even greater scale. Now, as far as the Neo-Catholics saying, oh, Paul VI was just talking about a couple of wayward theologians, well, this is what Monsignor Pozzo says about the state of the church in 2010, which is all the more true today. Unfortunately, he says, the effects as enumerated by Paul VI have not disappeared. A foreign way of thinking has entered into the Catholic world, stirring up confusion, seducing many souls, and disorienting the faithful. There is a spirit of self-demolition that pervades modernism. This is what Monsignor Pozzo observes in the church in 2010, all the more so true today. To my Neo-Catholic friends, I would say, wake up and smell the growing apostasy before it's too late.
Yeah, you know, and they really, you know what, Chris, I think they are. We're trying to use examples of you know, pretty high-profile commentators, bloggers around, younger men and women who are saying what needs to be said now. Maybe they were Neo-Catholics at one point. Maybe they never accepted that label. But the point is they're tired of the Neo-Catholic great facade. They're done with it. They are not going to be interned for the rest of their lives in Gulag Novus Ordo. And I think that you know, to those Catholics, and if they are or they were Neo-Catholics, I think the traditionalists have to open wide our arms. They come. We need help. We need to swell the numbers. We need to show the Vatican that there are millions of Catholics who are waking up, because it's my impression that if Pope Francis gets word of that, if the Neo-Catholics will stop, if they will lay off the big, massive parties and hoo-la-la every time something crazy happens in the Vatican just might reconsider and stop doing it. Right now, the fuel, the rocket fuel for this revolution going on in the Vatican, it comes from the Neo-Catholic cheerleaders, and it's got to stop.
Well, I've said this before. We have, in effect, the Mensheviks, who are the ideologues we've been talking about, or rather the Bolsheviks, the militant purveyors of the ideology who have revolutionized the church and now in their 70s are trying to finish off their revolution before they die. And then we have the enablers, the Mensheviks, who are more moderate than the Bolsheviks, but support the same ideas, at least in most cases. So they have been enabling this revolution by trying to explain it away. And they're still trying to explain it away. We have the Secretary of the Ecclesia Dei Commission warning that modernism has pervaded the church again, that the way of thinking that Paul VI lamented has spread throughout the church. Even today, they're still pretending it isn't happening. They have to stop.
That's right.
And
they have to stop, and as much as we have to, you know, encourage them to stop, we also have to celebrate the fact that a lot of them are stopping. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking right now at LifeSite News, which, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the premier pro-family, pro-life apostolates in the whole world, Chris. I'm looking at a headline, a screaming headline from LifeSite News, quote, Pope kisses the hand of, celebrates Mass with pro-homosexual activist priest. Hats off to John Henry Weston and his team at LifeSite News for, this is a difficult thing for them to say and to do. They're not traditionalists, but they're admitting the reality that something very, very problematic is taking place inside the Vatican under the reign of Pope Francis.
Well, yeah, of course, the Neo-Catholic spinmeisters, those who are still refusing to see the reality, will try to explain this away. Oh, it was just a very elderly priest and the Pope was showing his respect. So in other words, the Pope is the only one in the Catholic Church that doesn't know that this 93-year-old priest has been a lifelong gay activist, a champion of the LGBT community. So, and the Pope's instinctive reaction after he gives a private audience to this ecclesiastical menace is to slobber all over his hands and kiss them? Something is wrong.
What is the Pope doing kissing? Yeah, what is he doing kissing hands anyway like this? I just wish we could kind of get away from this earthy Pope thing that may be working for the fans of the Oprah Winfrey Show, but it's not working for millions of Catholics who are beginning to see through this Pope Humble the First thing, you know? Well, and doing that, kissing hands and doing all the breaking from protocol has led to a scandal like this one. Whether he knew for sure or not that Father was a homosexual activist, now we have another scandal to deal with.
Yeah, the idea that he would kiss the man's hands is just repellent. But, you know, I'm not here to pass any judgment on the Pope's subjective dispositions. I will say, though, that objectively speaking, he has just been, in terms of public relations and the image of the Church, a walking disaster. We never know what he's going to say next. And a lot of what he says is just false. Just the other day he said, and during his audience address this past Wednesday, and in God's eyes, we are the greatest, the most beautiful, the best things about creation. But Father, the angels? No, the angels are beneath us. We are more than the angels. We heard it in the book of the Psalms. No, we didn't. The book of the Psalms says we were a little less than the angels. We are obviously below the angels. St. Thomas Aquinas says that we are made in the image of God only in a certain, in a smaller degree than the angels are, because the angels directly encounter the divine essence, and we do not. And the other day he talked about the Gospel of Matthew, which recounts how our Lord called Matthew the tax collector to his mission in the church. And Matthew immediately got up and followed our Lord. Not according to Pope Francis. He said Matthew was thinking, no, this is my money. I have to hold on to my money. No, he didn't. Matthew, when he got the call, dropped everything in a miraculous fashion, was converted, and left it all behind immediately to follow our Lord. He didn't cling to his money.
It's, you know, we smile a little bit, gallows humor, but I mean, the point is, what traditionalists have been trying to do and been sort of lobbying for all along is that the Pope doesn't come down off the throne, doesn't go slumming with the folks. That's an enlightenment, that's an idea of democracy on steroids, and it leads to all of this. So the Pope keeps making these little mistakes and missteps. Why don't we have these same missteps from Pius XII or Pius XI, or it's because they followed a certain papal protocol that made sure scandal didn't visit itself upon the Church through these little missteps of the Pope. What was wrong with that? Why is that something we can't even possibly consider going back to?
Well, the reason is obvious, and I have to say it in all candor, because we can see it before our very eyes. The substance of the faith, the doctrines, the teachings of the Church, going back 2,000 years, are being replaced by the paraconciliar ideology. All that matters now is accepting Vatican II, whatever that means.
Right, right.
And that's the situation that's afflicting us right now. This is the final stage of what could be likened to a bout of pneumonia. Now the Church is in the terminal condition, to the extent that that's even possible. Obviously, the Church is not going to die, but the human element of the Church has 105-degree fever. And this delirious patient is still insisting on the conciliar renewal and the acceptance of Vatican II, which has never been explained to us in any satisfactory way.
No, that's exactly right, Chris. And the thing that the good, I guess, if there's a silver lining here, it would be that a lot of people in the younger generation, especially, they're waking up. You know, my wife just handed me something that came through on Parents Online yesterday, one of the clubs that she's with online for her homeschooling. And here's a great little article by a young priest called by the name of Father Marvin Deutsch. And he calls it the forgotten documents of Vatican II, in which he makes a case against what went wrong at Vatican II and the fact that they abandoned catechesis to such an extent that now we've gone from 20% of Catholics not going to Mass to 85% just in this country. And he points right back to Vatican II as having dropped the ball on catechesis. And I read that and I thought, boy, that's something that could have come right out of the pages of the Remnant. We're seeing more and more of this every day. And I guess to conclude this program on a hopeful note, that's the good side. They're desperate in the Vatican right now because, as we said at the beginning of this program, this little coup that's going on is made up of a lot of older gentlemen who are desperately trying to tape together their little revolution from when they were young. I don't think it's going to work.
Well, it can't work because the ideology that they are advancing is no substitute for the faith. It was dead on arrival at Vatican II. It was dead after Vatican II. It has no roots in tradition. That's why there are no vocations. That's why the seminaries have closed. That's why the convents have emptied. That's why the Catholic schools have been shut down. That's why the parishes are being consolidated. They refuse to see it because they are ideologues. But history is going to render a verdict on this colossal failure, and eventually the Church will move past it. It will move past it because the young people have had enough. And this is what the rear guard of the revolution is so afraid of. That's why they're trying to crush the young vocations and the Franciscan Friars, who are now trying to flee from under the Pope's thumb into the tender mercies of diocesan bishops. Well, they have at least a chance to pursue a traditional vocation. And that's why the Vatican is after the young vocations in the Sisters of the Immaculate.
That's right. And you know,
what they're trying to strangle in its crib the rebirth of the church in an authentic way, which is just a reconnection with the church's past. It's just timeless. It isn't a chronological past. It's a timeless past.
That's exactly it, Chris. And I know there's plenty of room for discussion on the situation with the Society of St. Pius X. But boy, oh boy, when you see this kind of thing happening to the Franciscan Friars and now to the Sisters, I don't think it's fair to say that those who were not exactly eager to have Bishop Fillet rush into the Vatican and make a deal, that they had some sort of schismatic spirit. This is exactly the sort of tyrannical persecution that those critics of a rapprochement between the Vatican and the Society of St. Pius X, that they feared. And like I said, there's plenty of discussion and debate to be had over that. But boy, this is a bad situation, and how the Vatican has handled the Franciscan Friars certainly has not helped the effort.
Well, we've seen a cycle in the church since the council. The cycle was one of revolution followed by resistance on the part of the Society of St. Pius X, followed at last by concessions from the Vatican, especially the historic concessions of Pope Benedict XVI, who finally liberated the Latin Mass from its ridiculous captivity with Summorum Pontificum. But now, with this pontificate, we're back to the 1970s again. And we're going to be placed in a position where we have to resist again. When they come for the Latin Mass, when they come for the conservative orders, I would say to those who are involved, don't obey an order to destroy what is good and true and beautiful in the church. Resist. We'll have no choice but to resist.
That's it. Another great last word, Chris. It was nice talking to you, and we'll catch up with you next week and continue to chronicle this demise of the human element of the Catholic Church, or of the revolution anyway.
Okay, Mike. Thank you.
All right, talk to you later.